A sign.
Yeah.
Give us a sign. We are on. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this joint event, lecture by Cooking Sections, hosted by Department of Architecture and Art Culture Technology program. My name is Azra Kshami. I'm the director of ACT program, and I will get us started with land acknowledgement, after which Nicolas de Monchaux, our department head, will introduce the speakers. MIT acknowledges indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocides and forced occupation of the territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial.
Thank you, Azra, and thank you everyone joining us here tonight in person and online. It is a great pleasure to do the introduction here tonight. In particular, I'm reminded by this introduction that we really all have two kinds of families. We have the families we are born into, and we have the families we make. And in that context, it's been my great pleasure to have known at least a section of Cooking Sections long before there was a Cooking Sections, and through a particularly treasured non-architectural connection, my de facto aunt and uncle, John and Peter Abelies, who are watching somewhere, somehow tonight as well, are lucky to count Alon as a cousin. And I was introduced to him in that context over a decade ago. Alon had forged an early career in theater and public performance in Israel and was interested in architecture, and in this auntly way I was asked to offer advice. Coming away from the very enjoyable lunch, I came to a couple of different conclusions. That A, Alon really needed no advice from me. His intensity and creativity were clear, and I was really looking forward to seeing what happened, which much of the last decade has revealed. I'm particularly excited at what is now his shared practice with Danielle Fernández Pascual, an equally remarkable spatial practitioner who it has been my great pleasure to get to know through Alon in the decade since. In this decade, I can say that I have been intellectually, spiritually, and even literally, as in food, nourished by the remarkable practice that the two have forged together, using site-responsive installation, performance, and video to explore all the places we are now, particularly at the overlapping boundaries between art, architecture, ecology, and geopolitics. Their work has been exhibited at Tate Britain, Serpentine Galleries, SALT Istanbul, the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, the Konstol in Stockholm, the 58th Venice Biennale, the US Pavilion at the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, curated by some of our own, the 13th Shanghai Biennial, Prospect 5, the Sharjah Triennial, and many, many, many more. They hold a research position and lead a studio unit at the Royal College of Art, London, and were recently guest professors at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. With both urgency and poetry, Cooking Sections have worked on multiple iterations of the long-term site-responsive project Climavore, including some of the work we'll see tonight, exploring how to eat as humans as the climate changes and as we move further into the ongoing climate crisis. For this work, they were nominated for the Turner Prize in 2021, received the special prize at the 2019 Future Generation Art Prize, and were finalists at the Visible Award for Socially Engaged Practices. Daniel is also the recipient of the 2020 Harvard GSD Wheelwright Prize for the research project Being Shellfish, which in the Piscean sense is the only sense in which he is shellfish. Before I finish, and again on this theme of family, institutional and otherwise, I want to express publicly the thanks of this department for the way in which Cooking Sections has generously supported our family here. In the past few years, some of the most wrenching challenges of our larger department family, which extends, of course, between architecture and ACT, have been felt by our colleague, Nita Sinekrot, who gave a dazzling lecture in this series last spring. These challenges are deeply connected to the central subject of that lecture, Sakia, Art, Science, Agriculture, an international residency program and research platform in the West Bank village of Ankinya, which Sinekrot co-founded with the architect Sahar Kaswami in 2016. It was in recognition and support of Sakya's mission of cultivation and understanding the cooking sections donated their prize money from the 2021 Turner Prize nomination to Sakya, and so to our family in 2021. In thanks, therefore, and in welcome, it is a great pleasure to introduce cooking sections in the spirit of family, of community, and appreciation for their contributions to all of us and our larger practices here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Hello. It's really a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I think as in this beautiful introduction said, I think there's like many familial and work. Sorry, they don't hear me.
So start again.
At home. Now, yes. So as I was saying, I think we have many familial and work connections to this place, and kind of have been circulating in the orbit of many people here, and it's really amazing to be able to be here in person with everyone. So thank you for having us.
And so for tonight, what we thought we would be doing is to present like a lot of the work we've been doing on salmon, surprise, and that started like almost 6 years ago. So we'll structure the lecture tonight almost in two parts. One that will talk about color, salmon, and many other stories, and then moving on to Climavore work and more recent projects.
Right, so we shall begin.
Oranges require orange to be. They are a color expectation. If an orange is not orange, it is no orange.
Oranges originated in China, where they were crossbred from a mandarin and a pomelo as early as the 4th century before Christ. From there, oranges passed from Sanskrit through Persian and its Arabic derivatives, traveling with the Moors, naranjas, soon dotted Al-Andalus and Sicily. Oranges arrived in England from France in the 14th century, their bright skins holding a taste of a color that became popular in market, on palates, and eventually in tongue.
For centuries, oranges were orange, and still orange was not a color. It was called yellow-red in English. It took another 200 years for the color to earn its name, to be ascribed to different forms like flowers, stones, minerals, or the setting sun.
To the west, oranges followed the path of Spanish missionaries to America and lent their name to Orange County and the Orange State. In California, the fruit fed the miners of the gold rush who passed through mission towns. In Florida, there were so many groves that by 1893, the state was producing 5 million boxes of fruit each year. In this tropical climate, nights too humid and too hot, oranges would ripen too quickly. They were ready to be eaten while still green, a problem. And so, from the 20th century onwards, green oranges have been synthetically dyed orange, coated to match consumer expectations. Orange reveals that humans cannot imagine a species detached from its color, even when we are the ones who detach it. This is the origin and story of what Aihisano calls the capitalism of the senses, the management of food color as a business practice, often invisible to consumers, in order to correct natural variation. As he remarks, the color of food is not merely a psychological characteristic, but a contested terrain where nature and technology intersect. Business interests, government regulation, and consumer expectation compete, and taste and sight are intertwined.
Amid all the observations that are made about industrialization and its consequences, the following is rarely heard. The world's colors are shifting. We grew up coloring in pictures of the world. Trees are green, oceans blue, yolks yellow. That everything else in life is turned regularly upside down is only tolerable because oranges remain orange and the sky blue. An increasing amount of industrial energy is directed, therefore, towards dyeing the world in natural colors so that life and commerce may proceed.
But dyes may miss their mark. Shifting cues in flesh, scales, skin, and leaves, wings, and feathers are clues to the environmental and metabolic metamorphoses around and inside us. The force that is color is not for domestication. It is fugitive. Color colors outside our lines. As Esther Leslie puts it, color is fragile and contingent. Color is fleeting, fugitive, unstable, more attuned to the memory than to the objective world, always escaping or seeping away, fading as night falls or when the sun shines too brightly. Chemists struggle to make it last. Color is motile, and in the realm of color, chemical color, synthetic color, nothing remains the same as it was yesterday.
In 2018, an eye-catching sparrow, the little bird, was spotted on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, but the sparrow was bright pink.
We know what sparrows are supposed to look like because they have evolved together with us. Over several millennia, food scraps from human settlements attracted sparrows from the wild, which mutated into a new species. House sparrows have since become a familiar sight wherever humans dwell. They metabolize the shades of our settlements into their brown-gray feathers. They are drabber than their older tree sparrow cousins who preserve the brighter tones of the forest.
The pink sparrow, neither forest nor house, was a color leak. The sparrow had turned salmon.
Salmon are home in color. Whipping her tail, a female salmon spends 2 days making a depression in the riverbed called a red, where she deposits her eggs. Fertilized, these spheres of nutrients encase young salmon who eat their way out, taking the color inside. Once the eggs are depleted, salmon swim to the ocean in search of food. They feed on the red-pink crustaceans, mostly shrimp and krill, as well as small fish with even smaller crustaceans in their digestive system. From these, they absorb yellow, red, orange fat-soluble pigments called carotenoids that tint salmon.
Salmon record their migration by metabolizing these shades. Their flesh is color coordinated with their homecoming journey. And if salmon could peer inside their own bodies, they could almost identify where they feed from, distinguishing from their muscle tones what they feed in the Trondheim Fjord or Skye or the Bering Sea.
When salmon are ready to breed, they stop eating. Their stomachs shrink to the size of a finger to make room for roe and milt, and they are drawn back to their birthplace, searching for home against the current.
The swim upstream requires such great exertion of energy that it pushes red pigment to the surface of a salmon's skin, a sign of health that actually lures mates. Female salmon pass on carotenoids in their flesh to plump their roe and make it attractive to prospective males. Color streams through generations, linking salmon to their red. Salmon color is the pathway, both metabolic and geographic, of being. It is the atmosphere in which salmon are born and die. Color, then, in this cosmos is more than cosmetic. It is both a biological influence, but also a very strong piece of memory.
Salmon is a means by which color moves according to a logic of ingestion. Salmon metabolize their color, literally drawing life from it, and humans, craving this color species, consume an image of health.
Such is the human thought of salmon. Scales encasing ink-perfect pink flesh, a river leaping with fish on the run, a color bound to a body, and a body bound to its own name. On the Isle of Skye, however, this pictorial logic is fading. Skye no longer runs salmon. Populations have fallen to historic lows as corporate aquaculture has filled the waters of the island with open-net salmon farms. Salmon, the color, and the fish is a red herring.
Open-net fish farms are flow-through feedlots, enclosed in pens with 100,000 to 200,000 other fish, a salmon cannot feed on krill or shrimp. Here, a salmon is naturally deprived of astaxanthin, the carotenoid that makes crustacean pink and protects its body from solar radiation and stress. A salmon's color reflects its well-being. Darker pink salmon represent access to astaxanthin-rich crustaceans, whereas pale pink salmon represents a lack of nutrients or high stress levels. Farmed salmon lacking these resources are no longer truly salmon. Their flesh tone is now closer to white-gray than red. Salmon the fish are deprived of salmon the color.
Pigmentation in farmed salmon also profits from being photo-manipulated. Consumer demand requires fish all year round, and so many fish farms in northern latitudes mask the seasons through artificial light.
Fluorescents mimicking summer sunshine are turned on and off.
On and off.
On and off.
And on and off. Most salmon do not know seasonal darkness in these brief 18 months of captive life before slaughter. 100,000 lumen bulbs are an ingredient in a lighting recipe that creates unseasonal, summer-like atmospheres. For farmed salmon, a year might indeed have 2 summers and no winter.
Salmon is perhaps the only animal to have been domesticated on a global scale within our lifetime. As Alex Blanchet notes in Procopolis, waves upon waves of industrialization have been compounded into farmed animal bodies over time, and there is nothing familiar or stable about the result. Under the weight of accelerated growth, farmed salmon spines curve, eyes wrap, tails shorten, and jaws bend. More than 90% of farmed fish can indeed be considered deformed. Fused and compressed vertebrae twist bodies to such an extent that salmon struggle to swim. The technology and labor that are needed to keep these industrial farm animals alive for optimal profit, Blanchet continues, shape bodies without remaking nature in service to human flourishing. Far worse, they leave behind unruly, polluted, and toxic environs.
Parasites like sea lice thrive on salmon bodies when they are crammed into the confines of the pen, easily multiplying as they jump between hosts. These parasites feed on the skin and blood of salmon, causing lesions, stress, and in some cases killing entire populations. The lesions, which make fish aesthetically unappealing and unmarketable, are the biggest problem for farms. Increasingly, poisonous toxins are the biggest problems for these enterprises. So to fight disease and parasites, even more toxins are added to the pen and metabolized into their flesh. But when chemicals are ineffective, salmon are even splashed with boiling water over short periods of time to detach the sea lice from their skin. But this is also an imprecise method. And as it happened in 2016, over 175,000 Scottish salmon were boiled alive during a not uncommon accident.
Another way to target parasites is through the use of laser beams. These optical Deleuzian devices go on and off, on and off, on and off, and on and off. The farm light regime is therefore a paradox. As growing seasons extend and fish multiply, parasites thrive, and more light enters the fray. Light necessitates light to keep up with market speeds.
Battery chicken farms are also manipulate light to accelerate growth, resulting in discolored meat. Consumers expect free-range color in poultry farm bodies, so hens are fed arsenic to make their flesh look chicken. Microdoses of poison color also kill some parasites along the way. So pests in battery chicken farms are like pests in battery fish farms. Parasites thrive in overcrowded conditions and eat caged animals alive. Salmon summer is also the season for cataracts. Warm water temperatures fog the lenses of fish eyes, and usually salmon swim deeper to escape the heat, but in the farms, there is nowhere to go. In these salmon worlds, most fish are blind and partially deaf, which at least may reduce the stress of living with the noisy machinery, heaters, and seal deterrents of the farm.
Hundreds of kilos of feed particles and antibiotics, which are distributed through hyper-efficient automated feeders that detect when the fish are hungry, billow out into the surrounding water. Clouds of fish excrement sink and blanket the seafloor, stiffening oxygen and creating uninhabitable dead zones. Chemical runoff from these toxic toilets leads to diseases and mutations in surrounding fish populations. Salmon farms now dot the coasts of Scotland, Iceland, Chile, Ireland, Canada, and Tasmania, but they also affect the waters and lands of other countries from South America to West Africa.
Salmon are fed up with anchovies, trolled oceans, ships that hoard the seas from Peru to the Horn of Africa. Salmon are fed the Humboldt Current, fed up with the Baltic, losing its sand eels and herring, fed up with dioxins, microplastics, metal traces, flame retarding their flesh. Fed up with krill pumped from the Arctic and Antarctic, poached from seals, whales, penguins, so the oils and the colors of the planet's poles can feed far-flung guts, orifices, and holes. Fish meals remove fish meals from local markets to factory boats. Feeding shores rank with the sludge and stench of fish meal, suck protein from the waters, leaving people fishless, and so they leave.
Humans leave because they are fed up with losing food to faraway salmon. Their lives transfigured, their communities trawled, their bodies marked with missing iron, zinc, and calcium. Shoreless, forced migrants bear the brunt of blue economies that sacrifice people's futures so farmed salmon can be fed. Mine nutrients, displaced labor, so farmed salmon can be fed Somali food security, fed Arabian coasts, fed the fish oils of Mauritania and the Gambia, fed the food of West Africa. Farmed salmon are fed human hunger when they are fed up, fed oil to make oil. Landscapes are extruded into fish oil that is turned into fish meal, that is bound into pellets that are turned into fish, that in turns turns into human flesh.
When the Scottish clearances happened some 200 years ago, the Gael people were dispossessed and evicted from their villages and also banned from their lands and forms of living as they used to. Sheep became more valuable than people. Today, the actions of salmon farming corporations are replicating a similar process by clearing the seabed, as more and more dead zones are appearing all around salmon farms. This new wave of oceanic clearances, we could say, is a multi-billion business for a few, but invisible to most humans above water.
Salmon is much more than what meets the eye. As Elizabeth Leon claims, salmon are bred to be hungry. Their job is to put on weight at any cost. What's more, we should rather consider the act of feeding salmon as a landscape-consuming practice at the planetary level. As a global commodity, farmed salmon defies any attempt to be pinned down to any particular geography.
Scottish salmon today does not entirely come from Scotland. Salmon hatching roe is part of an intricate network of and transnational circulation of precious genes with color pigments and eggs fertilized and incubated in different facilities ready to be sent from farming site to farming site to farming site all over the world. Therefore, Scottish salmon today, we could say, is neither entirely Scottish nor is it wholly salmon. An inventive marketing strategy around the origins and quality of farmed salmon has emerged in places like the UK.
The Scottish Salmon Company has branded themselves as purveyors of authentically Scottish salmon. Despite being registered in Jersey, owned by a Swiss bank with Ukrainian and Norwegian investors, floated on the Oslo Stock Exchange, and use imported Norwegian genetic material for their farmed salmon.
Greek seafood Hjaltland sources salmon from the wild waters of Shetland, but wild here refers to the water and not the fish itself.
It is no surprise that Marks & Spencer salmon brand name is Loch Muir. Indeed, a Scottish wilderness-sounding name, but Loch Muir is a place that does not exist on the map.
Aldi promotes best of Scotland salmon with an image of a fishing boat when it is actually farmed in Norway and the Faroe Islands.
Morrisons promote catch of the day salmon, which is sourced from farms in Norway, and Scottish quality salmon, which is farmed in Norway but only smoked in Scotland.
Scottish salmon has become a brand that needs to be rethought, and not only from an environmental and ecological perspective, but also questioning what Scottish and salmon mean in that construction.
Salmon is a species cleared from the metabolic process that constitutes salmon, both color and fish. It is our desire for color which eventually landscapes the environment. In natural habitats, animals use color to attract, warn, or camouflage. The absence of color indicates sickness, a body removed from the social functions of an ecosystem. In captivity, where mating is replaced by artificial insemination and predators by disassembly line, most colors fade. Yet to the human eye, a body without color is no body. So if food lacks color, or the body lacks the food that contains the color, then the body needs to be color-fed.
The equation feed conversion ratio is a tool to quantify the success of salmon. It indicates the precise quantity of feed pellets, around 3 kilos, that equate to biomass gain, which is around 1 kilo. It is that efficiency ratio by which feed is best converted into food and color. So these animals, which are neither beings nor objects, are the synthesis of ecology and economy. Living matter becomes a dislocated liquid volume cascading through planetary pipes that connect oceans with disassembly lines, mills, and packing facilities. Chicken and pigs are fed ground-up fish. Fish are fed ground-up chicken, and pigs and fish are fed ground-up fish. Millions of tons of animal travel the world as animal feed, and in every step, the color additives supplement the food deficiencies of each industrialized species, coloring the flesh that flesh ingests.
Feed is not just food, whether for humans or animals. It is a logistical operation that transfers matter from place to place and body to body. Dying and digesting bodies become color machines that process and propagate images of their wilderness, the fashioning of which they no longer control.
So the pink sparrow in sky, neither forest nor house, was appearing at the end of one of these voracious food chains. Its salmon feathers were a color leak, a sign. In farms, the color salmon lives also outside the fish. Gray salmon must be fed an imitation of their natural color, so farmers they cannot afford to feed salmon krill or lobsters. So since the 1970s, they've been feeding them with synthetic astaxanthin to stain salmon in multiple Pantones of salmon. At once gray and pink, they are also salmon.
15 hues classify salmon following 15 Pantone colors. You are looking at Pantone 1555U.
You are looking at 1565U.
You are looking at 1625U.
I'm looking at 1635U.
Are looking at 1575U.
I'm looking at 487U.
Are looking at 486U.
I'm looking at 1645U.
Are looking at 157U.
I'm looking at 1655U.
Are looking at 158U.
I'm looking at 1665U.
Are looking at 485U.
I'm looking at 2347U.
Are looking at 2028U.
You are looking at the 15 Pantones of salmon.
The Salmon is a universal system used by the salmon industry to apply synthetic salmon tones to fish. Darker-hued salmon, fed more astaxanthin, are more expensive than lighter shades, while salmon lower than 23 on the scale here is difficult to sell at any price.
The salmon palette was invented by Hoffmann-La-Roche after decades of producing food, coloring, and medicines derived from petrochemicals. La-Roche took a special interest in synthetic astaxanthin in the 1990s. Their Salmon scale allows now salmon farms to decide the precise amount of astaxanthin, the pigment, to feed fish according to the different tastes of their market. In 2002, La Roche sold Salmon trademark together with their vitamins and chemicals divisions to Dutch state mines, which was originally set up as a coal mining enterprise. DSM today markets synthetic carotenoids as nutritional products for farmed salmon and farmed shrimp under the trade name of Carophile Pink.
Humans taste with their eyes just as much as with their tongues, and in DSM's own words, color is essential to the sensory perception of quality. Salmon the color, the flesh, the fish, the system, is an image produced by and dependent on generic geographies.
We paint the world in the colors we expect to see. And in doing so, we also color our own expectations. Yet, salmon struggle to achieve the perfect salmon that consumers demand of their flesh, even with the aid of synthetic coloring. Their color is affected by the levels of anxiety, exhaustion, and crowding in the farm. These different stresses create their given color by reducing their metabolization of astaxanthin, the synthetic pigment. So homogeneity in color amongst farmed salmon, even in the same farm, is almost impossible, and so faulty colors appear.
At the time of slaughter, 10 to 30% of salmon have black spots in their muscle fillets, a sign of tissue damage. No one wants to eat fish colored with polka dots, so they are discarded. Color is all that matters.
The salmon sparrow in sky was a warning signal of this very possibility, a body consumed by the color of another species, a red flag.
In 1856, William Perkins was trying to synthesize quinine as a treatment for malaria. In the process, he accidentally isolated maize from coal tar, unleashing the colors held fast in the sludge of energy. Little did he know, this would come to be called aniline, and would be the base of a synthetic color revolution, as well as the origin of almost all chemical and pharmaceutical companies.
Turning coal tar into other kind of substances was far more rewarding than any alchemist could have dreamt, providing the means by which the world could be completely repainted. Coal tar's darkness, Esther Leslie again claims, was the origin of a color rush. The rainbow could be extracted from the mine rather than the colony, and a seemingly new world order began in which pigment took hold at the molecular level. The color industry reached its explorative heights in Nazi Germany when companies like Agfa, BASF, Bayer, and other coal derivatives companies consolidated into IG Farben, and Farben meaning colors in German, and instrumental too, and the instrument of Hitler's regime, IG Farben created everything from dyes to paints to food coloring. Using slave labor from concentration camps, it revolutionized the standardization and also the commodification of color, while also manufacturing Cyclone B, the deadly poison of the gas chambers.
Since the advent of industrialism, color has been moving. It fades and is fed, but it also morphs and changes, signaling environmental shifts. The most famous interspecies toxic class struggle of the 19th century is that of the moth. As factories rose between London and Manchester, both town and country darkened. Walls and streets were blackened, and white lichen on the bark of trees on which white moth lurked faded. Formerly camouflaged, they became easy prey, and a rare kind of moth with black spots of melanin took their niche.
By 1848, fully black specimens had become a common enough sight in Manchester that they were classified as their own species. Opposed to the white-bodied, the typica, the normal, the black-bodied moth was named Carbonaria. As if carried by the billowing plumes of chimneys and smokestacks, carbon gave itself to another form, animating carbon color, and by the end of the century, Carbonaria almost twice outnumbered Typica.
The struggle of the peppered moth signaled an ecochemical crisis. The moth mothed into atmospheric pollution. Industrialism, an unprecedented release of energy into new systems, classifies. It counts, groups, and naturalizes differences that emerge as environments transform. Classification depicts the new in the context of the existing. It domesticates and depoliticizes the struggle of adaptation. Like wilderness, it organizes life into a static image. The irony is, we cannot imagine a species removed from its color, because we taxonomize, at least at first, visually.
Far from a sudden mutation, this case of the peppered moth is evidence of how human-made toxic environments affect natural selection and also resilience. Solid, non-living body parts like chitinous wing covers, insect armors, bird feathers like in the sparrow, mollusk shells, mammal fur, hair, they're all kind of substances that incarnate new molecules and are also colored by their own atmospheres around them.
Like moth mothing moth, pigeons with darker feathers are now reproducing faster than their lighter fellows. They pigeon. Melanin is pigment and protection, drawing the ions of toxic trace metals from their bodies to their pinion. Zinc and sometimes lead deposit in their wings, color coordinate them with their urban environment. Even after death, birds keep atmospheric toxins in their feathers. We can read the composition of urban air in the way feathers feather toxins.
Ornithologists along the east coast of the US have noticed that some yellow-feathered birds have begun to mold crimson. Like the salmon sparrow in Skye, their body color and their species color no longer align. As temperatures rise in the area, plant life has adapted, and red honeysuckle berries now proliferate in their local habitat. So when woodpeckers and waxwings feed on this once uncommon fruit, they metabolize another compound called rhodocyanthine, a red pigment that alters the color of their feathers. When yellow woodpeckers feather invasive berry, we can tell that the berries are turning rising temperature.
In the 1980s, herpetologists began to notice that American and British frog populations were dying at an alarming rate. Before death, the frog legs would grow inflamed, turning red. Color was swelling their skin, a sign that frogs were infected by a freshwater bacterium. They were being poisoned by their natural habitats, pushed out of the rivers and ponds where they had always lived. Research revealed that they were ingesting PCB toxins that had dissolved in the water sources. Once metabolized, PCB altered the frog immune system and made them more vulnerable to the bacteria that was already present in their habitats. PCB has no color, but when metabolized, they cause color, the color of an ecosystem reorganized.
Pigs that live in forests have darker skin for camouflage. When pigs were domesticated and stopped fearing predators, they evolved into a hairless pink. Pigs were coerced into pig, and like wild salmon, black pigs were classed as a new wild species.
Swine megafarms collect hog feces, urine, blood, and other bodily fluids in lagoons. Bright pink anaerobic bacteria added to break down the sludge turn the lagoon pig. Wherever hog farms proliferate, water turns high-density animal feedlot, a radiant pig.
Meanwhile, on the Pacific coast of Mexico, a shrimp caught in the Chacagua Lagoon no longer turn red when they are cooked. Chacagua means place where shrimp thrive in the Mixtec language. But local fisher people say that the lagoon is getting sick. This body of water lies along the Oaxaca fault, and every time that the earth tremors, hundreds of crustaceans float, dead, to its surface. Chemical sediments from upstream papaya plantations have accumulated on the lagoon over the years, so any quake churns them up. And in the Philippines, as pollution also changes and alters the water chemistry, astaxanthin-rich microalgae die, and shrimp no longer have the red food to feed on. So instead, the shrimps are starving in blue, heavy metals blacken their gills, bacteria inflame shells in black or bright red, and parasites strangle their ovaries in white and choking their heads in yellow. A shrimp, but in such an eclectic manner that they no longer look like a shrimp. New assemblages of metals, viruses, and bacteria configure now their bodies.
Unreadable, inedible, unreadable shrimp signal a chemical reorganization of the water and the life around it. Their failure to color shows us the tones of water chemistry imbalance and a future of interspecies miscommunication, species misrecognition, failed courtship, infertility, lack of camouflage, and all in all, the impossibility of shrimp survival. In our post-industrial era, the amount of toxic substances circulating through bodies is such, Hannah Landecker notes, that bodies are actually the ones circulating through chemicals and not the other way around. Likewise, instead of bodies metabolizing color, it appears that color is now metabolizing bodies.
Color no longer flows through bodies, but rather bodies are flowing through color. Darwin today may or would not have written on the origins of species, but rather on the origins of color, perhaps, as the contemporary struggle for life. Natural selection replaced by color selection. To sense that struggle, to see it, necessitates a vision that is interspecies and interspectra, for color species do not hold to human expectations anymore. Color species are at home in pathways that innervate and bind senses beyond sight. The bodies and lands that flow through color species are the atmosphere, or we could say the chromatosphere, in which color species live. Color species then are rewriting this anthropogenic natural history of forms of inhabitation.
A bright pink foam of lead, cadmium, nickel, and mercury runs into India's Yamuna River from textile factories. This runoff leaches into the soil, warming up roots and making the vegetables that grow in the fields nearby taste fast fashion. Fast fashion flows from the river to the plants to the textile worker who eats them and back out again.
In Mumbai, fast fashion metabolized 11 dog bodies, strays who swam in the Kasadi River to cool down amidst the summer heat, but they turned cyan blue. As low-cost fast fashion producers concentrate their facilities in countries with cheap labor and lax environmental regulations, it is not uncommon to see rivers running trendy seasonal colors. And so the dogs that swim in must-wear color rivers become must-wear color dogs.
Red Hook in Brooklyn had an incredibly hot summer in 2010. Flowers and blossoms withered, and hives in the area began to glow incandescent red. It seemed that starving bees had resorted to non-floral food sources. As Brooklyn bees fed on cherry syrup from a nearby factory, red 40 petrochemical colorant metabolized bees, honey, and hive.
At the ends of the Earth, these chromatospheres show signs of a new bipolar order. In the Arctic, air losing transparency due to suspended chemicals distorting the trajectory of sunlight is snow. Ocean water pollutants accumulated in fat is actually fading seal skin. What seems like orange snow rust is actually parasites thriving in rising polar temperatures. So the Arctic does not Arctic white any longer.
In the Antarctic, the snow is pink, but less so than before. Penguin poo turns pink as the result of the penguin feeding on astaxanthin-rich krill. But as the krill overfishing diminishes the part of their diet, penguin colonies are losing their characteristic tone. The snow remains plain white even after penguin droppings are deposited on its surface, and their migration can no longer be color traced from above. In the Antarctic, it snows salmon.
Flamingos raised in captivity lack access to astaxanthin-rich algae, so zoos feed them flamingo to keep up with visitor expectations. Just as farmed salmon, flamingos, flamingo. In the meantime, the algae that give flamingos their distinctive salmon color are the latest wonder ingredient in human beauty products. You can now flamingo your skin, your hair, and your nails.
Our skin biologically protects us while exposing us to the politics of perception, shifting with the popularity and decay of skin bleaching and tanning products. The perception of skin tones have changed over time, showing the unstable relationship between class and race, as well as the human obsession with bodily appearance. Tanning gummy bears allow now light-skinned humans to metabolize the color of the sun without sitting under it. They are just another wave of food supplements to alter skin from inside out.
Bodies have become filtering devices. Humans and animals are disposable hosts for synthetic color. Humans struggle to imagine a species detached from its color, even when we are the ones who detach it. Shifting cues in flesh, scales, skin, feathers are all clues to the metabolic and metamorphoses around and also inside us. Life in this chromatosphere denies salmon the right to their own colors.
As diets and desires transform plant and animal bodies, we need to learn the struggle of living with and within color. After all, we color the chromatosphere, and the world is already saturated. Salmon is the color of a wild fish that is neither wild, nor fish, nor even salmon. After decades of overfishing, exhaustive salmon farming, and color leaks, the water surrounding salmon farms have reached a point where seasonal productivity, ecology, and employment need to be rethought.
Food seasons, as we know them, have ceased to exist. In a supermarket, you can find strawberries, tomatoes, oranges, plums, or even salmon all year round. They are filling the shelves in any season, and you have all of them at once.
Beyond this flattened, continuous, 365-day-long season, what would be the new periods we could eat according to today? If humans have been changing environments, how can we also change our food system to adapt to them and build other forms of landscape?
Climavore proposes how to eat as humans change climates, or actually how to live as humans in changing climates. As seasons creep, we recognize that eating less industrial meat protein or more locally grown produce or more plant-based dishes is crucial, but perhaps it is not enough.
Climavore is a form of devouring that follows the consequences of anthropogenic landscapes affected by extractivism. Different from carnivore, omnivore, locavore, vegetarian, or vegan diets, it is not so much the ingredients that define Climavore, but rather the infrastructural responses to human-induced climatic events.
Climavore aims to rethink the environmental futures of coastal inhabitation and the coastal commons through a diet that can effectively transform both desires but also infrastructure. It is a call for us humans to identify salmon sparrows and to perhaps evolve from omnivores into climavores, eating for and with a planet in constant flux.
New seasons of food production and consumption have begun to appear. In this case, of polluted ocean, of polluted shores by salmon farms, we focus on the tidal zone, an ambiguous site that appears, disappears, reappears, and constantly changes in sight.
Coastal space has no clear definition and opens up for murky yet cleaner forms of usership. And it can become today a new entrance to a new ecology, economy, but also an imaginary for the island. Other understandings of aquacultures in sky that differ from salmon farming are in a way a site of opportunity also for the restoration of the tidal commons.
Human-induced climatic alterations of the water, ranging from increasing acidification of the sea, appearance of new parasites, and disappearance of species, need to be rethought. Through forms of eating that address reabsorption and breakdown of industrial residues, a new metabolic order may emerge.
Different from intensive salmon farming that produces an excess of nitrogen, other creatures do opposite processes. They clean the water by breathing. Filter feeder bivalves like clams, scallops, razor clams, barnacles, and also seaweeds like kelp, sea lettuce, or dulls, they all provide an incredible source of easy access protein without any need for feed or fertilizers. And despite having lost connection today to some of these ingredients, they were abundant and used by both humans and animals in this part of the world.
From the Neolithic to the 18th century clearances, when people were displaced to edgelands and wastelands, seaweeds and bivalves have been the key ingredients in the Scottish diet. There are abundant archaeological findings of oyster middens and prehistoric sheep with remains that mark their teeth that indicate a kelp-based diet. Even in modern times, a booming industry in Skye emerged for kelp-based explosives during the Napoleonic Wars in the 1820s. Kelp was used to improve poor soils for millennia. In places like Jersey and the Channel Islands, the use of seaweed collected from the ocean as a fertilizer had been a common practice, with law explicitly regulating citizen rights and optimal seasons for its gathering.
Certain varieties like kelp or bladderwrack had abundant quantities of minerals that once laid on the fields, they would slowly be released and accelerate the growth of vegetables and tubers.
Crofters have used the tidal zone not only for fish traps at low tide, but also to forage dulls and eat it raw or boiled in soup.
Over centuries, food sourcing from the tidal zone enabled social structures where women were the strength of fishing economies, from sorting oysters on the beach, lifting the catch, to literally having to carry their feeble husbands to shore.
Oysters have also been a long, cheap source of protein for the working class. In the east coast of the US, oyster traders had not only street stalls, but also hybrid house barges, from where they would moor in different piers to sell their stock to wholesale suppliers. Their mobile barges were a hybrid between a fishing facility, a shop, an impromptu eatery, and a home altogether.
After sourcing oysters from naturally occurring beds, it was also discovered that they could be grown in larger scale oyster tables, which are structures going hundreds of meters into the sea, where oysters are washed by the tides following moon cycles.
In Skye, our oyster table functions as a dining table and opens the discussion around the aquacultures that could happen. Every day at high tide, the structure allows its oysters, mussels, and seaweeds to breathe. One oyster can filter up to 120 liters of seawater per day.
At low tides, and here you see it from above, the oyster table emerges above the sea and functions as a dining table, where we place some humans. And over breakfast, lunch, or dinner, according to the tides, performative meals have been served to discuss a different series of Climavore ingredients. Also workshops with fishermen, politicians, residents, scientists discussed another cultural imaginary for the island. Guests enjoyed bloody oyster cocktails, crunchy shingles, lasagna for sure, among many other Climavore delights.
Aiming to divest away from salmon farming and develop alternative and regenerative aquacultures that work towards socially reparative futures, a network of Climavore restaurants was also established. Each replaced farmed salmon with a dish made with seaweeds or bivalves.
And we had a food truck, or a local bakery, or a bar, a hotel, even Michelin star restaurant who served Climavore dal soup or coca kelp Climavore ice cream, Climavore kelp whiskey, twice-dived Climavore scallops, or Climavore rope-crown mussel nibbles.
The word restaurant originates from bouillon restaurant, an establishment in the 19th century France whose name literally translates as restorative soup. Named after a specialty dish intended to warm and nourish people's bodies. In the climate emergency, the restaurant, alongside school canteens, collective kitchens, and so many other feeding spaces, all need to become a place not only to restore the human body, but also a venture to care for the planet's ecology, to promote systems that grow regenerative foods while cultivating habitats. At the core of our project and exhibition, Salmon and Red Herring at Tate Britain in 2022 and 21, Tate removed salmon from their menu in all of its cafes and restaurants across its 4 sites in perpetuity, and introduced a Climavore menu instead.
These consisted of many seaweed-based dishes instead of farmed salmon, but also a new beer that was produced with Cullen Brewery in Skye that used oyster shells for carbonation and kelp in the brewing process.
As part of our Becoming Climavore campaign with the Serpentine Galleries in London, 22 museums in the UK also removed salmon and introduced Climavore dishes made with ingredients that regenerate soil and water.
All along, the work in Skye continues. So the Climavore station is a catalyst to divest the island away from salmon farming and promote regenerative aquacultures in plural instead. And this is done through 3 streams: learning, growing, and building.
Apprenticeships for local teenagers from the professional cooking school have trained them to become Climavore cooks, after which they are awarded a placement in the partner restaurants that removed farmed salmon. It is the future cooks of the island who can start introducing a new coastal imaginary.
These foodways build upon oral histories and also archival records portraying the uses of seaweed through recipes, songs, Gaelic sayings, and also place names that indicate that long connection between people and seaware.
New cultivation techniques are also being developed for an intertidal polyculture farm, growing a multiplicity of species as an ecology, an intertidal habitat that monitors and regenerates the coast. In collaboration with community trusts in Skye and Raasay, this ongoing model works towards building a network of microfarms. They enhance a variety of aquacultures in coastal communities across Scotland and beyond.
After the first baseline surveys and water analysis we've been doing to understand existing conditions and current non-human inhabitants, the first wild seeding tests were done in collaboration also with local marine biologists and have shown the potential for that collective growth.
Different materials and textures were tested for the seaweeds to attach to them. Ropes were handmade out of braided heather, moorgrass, or even bladderwrack seaweed, which underwater species seem to love more than nylon.
Climavore is also introducing new systems and cycles to encourage the consumption of filter feeders that improve the marine environments in which they live and connect us better to the material and extractivist histories of these waters.
As part of the learning strand of Climavore, we've worked with the local college on a new syllabus for the construction course. The new Climavore aquacultures include cycles of growth and bivalve consumption that still produce waste, especially shells from filter oysters, and mussels that do not decompose that easily and are sent to the landfill. Instead of externalizing it, waste needs to be incorporated, metabolized, reabsorbed, and recirculated into nourishment cycles, giving good radiance to bad rubbish. Cement is the second most consumed product in the world after water, a major industry contributing to carbon emissions and a main culprit to the climate breakdown. Climavore believes then in connecting the food and construction industries through new waste streams that can source responsive material based on scraps from intertidal origins.
So from these seagrass roofs in Denmark to different typologies of oyster walls in China, or shell cladding in Turkey, or shell-based mortar in Taiwan. Learning from a series of installations developed in New Orleans and LA with tabby concrete, we also worked in Taiwan to revisit the old Sanhetu technique, which is a cement-like mix made out of oyster shells, sticky rice, and sugar, and is then literally cooked as a soup.
No construction materials can replace cement and petrochemical aggregates with the waste shells collected from Climavore restaurants. By mimicking heat and compression over millions of years, crushed waste shells can be brought back to a new solid form that reverses geology and might turn the earth outside in again. This involves incorporating the waste streams from consuming mussels and oysters, collecting the shells from local restaurants, clean, crush, classify, mix, and cure.
Our initial prototypes used 50% cement, 50% clams, mussels, and oysters. The second stage, the cement was completely replaced with lime made from waste shells that we collected from the restaurants in Skye. And then the latest version has completely eliminated any burning material, not even at low heat, so without burning, and used only hydraulic pressure to make 100% shell and water material.
Through the many metabolic interactions with toxicity and waste, nutrients, oxygen, the tidal zone is the space for redefining the spatial construction of the ocean and its shores. To rethink coastal policy and facilitate small-scale independent economic initiative, the Climavore Station works across education, farming, material, oral histories, and legal action in order to create new frameworks for recommoning the coast, and all of this while serving delicious Climavore dishes.
Slowly, people coming up to Skye and Raasay will ask for Skye kelp, or Skye dulls, or Skye oysters, or Skye mussels, ingredients that regenerate the coast there by breathing in this era of increasingly evident human-induced climatic events.
Therefore, in the tidal zone, we can determine what we eat as humans change climates.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this powerful lecture. May I invite you to join us for a discussion with the audience and with Alejandro Medina, who will be moderating the discussion. Alejandro is a Guatemalan-born artist and a graduate student in Art Culture Technology program. His work explores human relationship to nature. He has a wonderful solo exhibition at the Wiesner Student Art Gallery. I encourage everyone to see it before it goes down soon. Alejandro, you will get us started with a couple of questions, and then we will moderate and open to everyone.
Great.
Okay, thank you. We're fine.
Yeah, I think we can stay there. Great. Well, no, thank you very much for that astounding and really incredible lecture. I had the opportunity to see a previous version of this lecture a few years ago, but it's just as astounding as the first time I saw it, I think. And it's incredible to see how the lecture has changed as you deepen your research and engagement with the island of Skye. Personally, I think that one of the things that has always drawn me to your work is this understanding that I think a lot of the work is based on, that change can only be achieved through a sustained effort and long-term commitment to a context, a site, a community, a species, or even the commitment to thinking through the lens of a specific color, as we saw in the lecture today. And after all these years of you guys working in the island of Skye, which is, I think, 6 years now, you mentioned at the beginning, I wonder if this urban myth of the pink sparrow is now replaced by a myth of the two artists dressed in salmon hanging around the island trying to help divest it from salmon farming. And so I have one quick question, and then we can open up to the long lounge. And as well, we can take questions from the online audience. Those can come in through Zoom or YouTube, I believe. And so my question is just about unexpected collaborators. I'm wondering if there's any stories of human, non-human, or perhaps even beyond human collaborators that you have come across with as you've been engaging with not only the site in Skye now, but as you kind of expand your practice to other sites and contexts around the world.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it's interesting to see also the work has evolved a lot since it was first commissioned in 2016 by a local arts organization called Atlas Arts. And then slowly we figured out that the oyster table was perhaps not enough. It was kind of a catalyst, but we needed a whole series of programs or different forms of exchange with people living all year round there. And that's when we slowly set up a team with a project coordinator, Shona, that is there kind of spearheading all the activities. And also, like, as perhaps we are not the visible kind of face there, but it's the team there that is actually like a day-to-day delivering and coming up with the continuation of all the entire framework. And slowly, I think we are more like involved in perhaps on the other side of the story, which is more the consumer side, not so much the production side, to precisely kind of exchange all these bits of information. In terms of collaborators, I think through that also we've come across a lot of super interesting people and also non-humans, from, as we were saying before, from marine biologists we've been working with, or fabricators on the island, or residents, or people even that do not, or either were fired from a salmon farm as workers, or do no longer want to work in that, and are looking for alternatives. So that's where we see also the whole project through the material development for that to become a material for the island, but also these prototypes for multi-species intertidal farms as an alternative, because always the motto is always that no, salmon farms provide jobs, and this argument of providing jobs has always been used or misused for different political decisions that could be more or less contested. So we've come across incredible people along the way, but also even more recently, it's been quite interesting to see how in the first prototypes we've been doing with the ropes and the seaweeds, how there are species that we never anticipated that are also kind of arriving to those kind of ropes. Even like fish are like starting to kind of lay their eggs in between the ropes. So it's been kind of an interesting process. And the same also even with bacteria. That's another new companion that we are now testing for the actual cleaning of the shells. It's very laborious, so you can do it with water, or you can leave the shells somewhere for little critters to also eat them. The food remains.
Yeah. But I think also for me, like what your question perhaps brings, and I think it's a kind of a question of methodology, right? And it's a question of like not only kind of who are the collaborators like that one finds along the way, but like which kind of doors do you open in order to kind of create these kind of shifts in perception and kind of and how do you create like shifts in behavior, or essentially like how do you create change? And I think this is like along the way, right, when we first heard about, like when we went for the first time to Skye in 2016, and back then we knew like very, very little about like salmon farming, and we kind of started talking to people, and kind of it became like obvious that this is like quite a big thing, and that there are communities that have been fighting this for like many years, and we spoke to two people that like two biologists that were telling us about this story about the sparrow, right? And this was like, I mean, this is like a good urban legend, as you said, but like we were like, this is not like for real. And yet, like for 2 years, I think it kind of, the story like sparked like such an imagination, and kind of started really kind of questioning the whole kind of process of salmon through color, that like then when it appeared 2 years ago, like on someone documented this like pink sparrow, and it was like aired on the BBC, we were like, okay, right? Like, so that kind of led kind of the color kind of stream to a next kind of phase. And from there, we brought in like all of these other species in order to understand like how the world is being reorganized through color, in order for us to kind of be able to kind of constitute like this project essentially. So I think it's like, this is twofold. On the one hand, like things come to you like as a, but like many times I think part of it is like how, as like practitioners, do we like open up the possibilities, or kind of enable these kind of like ensembles of like different kind of collaborators that each one has perhaps like different role, kind of become a project.
Right. No, it's this opening to encounters, you know, that is so interesting and has led to such meaningful interventions, you could say, onto the island. So yeah, I think we can open up to the long lounge if anyone has any questions. I will pass the microphone around. Yep. So yes, Caroline.
Inevitably, this was really fantastic and so stimulating, but I would have to confine myself because I could go on forever. Starting with the mantis shrimp, which sees 60 colors or something like that. But green, you really didn't talk about green, which is an entire political project. And I wanted to just point out to you that the chemical additive on the salmon fan has this strange neologism ending in phyll, P-H-Y-L-L, which is of course borrowed from chlorophyll, which is green of leaf. And this is just a comment. In my work on animal agriculture, which is not a farm anymore, so we also need to change that word, they vegetalize the animal that is going to be eaten. So the pigs are ripened, they're harvested, right? So that for me was a tell. The salmon are being plantified. If the salmon can be made into leaves, guilt is over, right? Hunting is vorbeigegangen. We can just eat them like leaves. So there is a relationship to the vegetal that is somehow unproblematic, but you know, we need to think about that too. Long comment, not really a question, but
No,
It's
it's a
a
great
thank
question.
you,
Yes.
thank you so much.
No, it's a great question, and I think it's yes, it's something that we very briefly touch about, like, but I think there's also, and this is like really where it's, as a kind of industrialized species, one of the challenges for an industry with salmon is that they haven't managed to vegetalize the fish, and still 30% of the feed comes from like from other fish basically. And this was reduced, like, I mean, they started like in the 60s with like 100%, and this was like brought down to 30. But still, with this whole kind of pursuit of like trying to produce omega-3, right? You have to like feed omega-3 in order to produce omega-3, or else you are just producing omega-6, basically. So still, although there's a lot of soy protein that is going into it, kind of still kind of the massive kind of extraction of the industry is still happening like in the sea. So I think therefore, so far we have confined ourselves like to the more kind of blue economy rather than kind of to the whole kind of green question, which I think is, yes, as you were saying, it's a whole political project kind of its own.
Thank you so much for your enlightening talk. I wanted, so your lecture today was very much focusing on like what you call like the chromatosphere of like food landscape. And I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on something you touched on in the end, which is almost like the chromatosphere of the built environment. Because I mean, I know that both of you are teaching in architecture schools or have been teaching in architecture schools, and there is specifically like there's a history of like different colors in architecture, like the white of the Bauhaus, or the international style, the gray of brutalism, and then the beige of the suburban. But each one of these has kind of like is lacking really material history, like the one that you're laying out. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that and like how to approach that.
Yeah, no, interesting. We haven't been connecting directly the color in the kind of later part of the work as a concept. So far, what we've been doing in particular with the shells is using almost either the color itself of the shells as it comes, without necessarily kind of painting or rethinking about what pigment should it be. So far, it's almost like two separate things, I would say.
Yeah, but I think in that regard, it's also, yeah, again, it's a great project, like in the sense that I think it's really interesting to kind of think or kind of how these materials kind of histories and color develop. But I think here, and I think there is a lot of potential kind of in the work that we're developing now to think about this kind of forms of metabolism and how like actual metabolism like as a chemical and biological process and how that kind of constitutes color, right? But and I think this is a big part of the lectures. Exactly, it's not about like it's color not as an aesthetic choice, right? It's color as a process and kind of what constitutes color as a process and how kind of these. And I think many times in architecture, like this idea of color is much more connected to the kind of emergence of kind of the industrial color industry and the fact that suddenly from like working in like natural like architecture as a palette of like available materials, right? And kind of their chemical processes that made them into these color, suddenly since the like mid-19th century, you can start kind of reproducing architecture in any color that you choose, right? And therefore, kind of the way kind of that is mobilized through white in the Bauhaus, et cetera, becomes like a sort more of a political kind of, or like a political aesthetic choice rather than kind of metabolic process. And yes, perhaps I think it's like really interesting to kind of try and draw that back, right? Like that the building becomes a shade of an environment in which it exists, and kind of how's that as another symbol of like a certain kind of time or kind of a representation of a certain kind of climatic breakdown or transformation that's happening.
Yeah, but also not to see only the building as an object, but the built environment at large, and the way perhaps we use these color threads is, as we were saying, as warning signals. So when you see a color or the absence of a color, how do you trace that back to the production of it, the extraction of it, etc.? Yeah.
I had a question about your methods, and you have such an interesting practice, and I would ask you to expand a little bit about how you work and why do you are artists, you're not problem solvers. why did you decide not to speak about these issues only in the art institutional context? You obviously work with communities, you put yourself in the sea, you work with fishermen, you are part of a kind of economy. What is that about? Could you describe a little bit what about your position in the field and what this work that you're doing requires artists to do, and maybe what you're asking us to think about too?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for yes. No, and I think also
you
for us,
did so nicely.
no, and I think also for
To think architect. I mean, your salmon.
yes,
The architect, and I can't quite come up with what that is. but
Yes.
I feel like it's relevant.
yes, and I think yes, and I think also this is like why it's also great for us to be speaking in this context, because I think in many ways this is, you know, it's not only that we need to speak about like breaking down these kind of boundaries or kind of these definitions, because like this is not what the work is about in any way, but I think for us it's the question is or I think there's a certain kind of drive to think about how we create transformation and kind of what requires to change things essentially. And this is, I think, where in many ways kind of these disciplinary kind of boundaries are just like are not helpful, I think, for us, I believe, and perhaps also not for like practice at large, but I think this is also like people use that in different ways. So I think that is like there's many rooms of how to think about that, but essentially we kind of, I think more and more kind of at the beginning started doing a lot of work that was kind of more reflecting or kind of representing kind of issues around kind of food systems and how kind of they reflect on kind of geopolitics and kind of the built environment. And it's at a certain point it just made like, okay, where the kind of there's a mode of like representation, but it's like how is that, and we're building awareness perhaps, but like awareness is being built like all the time, right? And kind of awareness building in many ways you could say that it's just like enables kind of more forms of kind of capitalization that by new economies that are emerging to kind of respond to that. So from there, I think it's kind of, and really I think this is kind of, this project from 2016 that we've been working on for the past 6 years is kind of a real kind of catalyst in our practice, because there was suddenly a question of like, how do we represent something, but at the same time, like how do we use the form of kind of representation or space of kind of, as also as a space of like transformation, and how could we kind of start to think of work that kind of exists in kind of both realms at the same time. And this is also like very challenging, because many times like then you get invited like to do an exhibition in a museum, right? And like a museum in many ways is kind of what we see today are two things. One, that museums, everyone wants to be talking about ecology and about the climate breakdown and all of the crises that we're in. But the work is very reflective work, and we're kind of thrown back again to kind of be talking about the thing rather than being able to do the thing or to think how we transform the thing, because the institutions that we inherit or inherited are completely ill-equipped to kind of answer the questions of our time. Like, how can you be talking about ecology in an exhibition that runs like for 8 weeks, right? Like, where's kind of ecological, like, there's like the antithesis to like ecological time, basically. So I think then it's exactly like, how do we start using institutions, or kind of our role as artists in that case, right? That can come into an institution and say like, I'll do an exhibition at Tate, but I'll do an exhibition at Tate if Tate removes salmon, right? And then you would kind of use your kind of position as a point of leverage. And I think it's a lot about kind of where do we kind of, how we understand these kind of infrastructures that we're kind of working within, both kind of in the food system, but in the cultural systems, and kind of finding kind of these points of intervention and kind of ways that we can kind of alter them.
And maybe back to the methodologies that you were asking, more concrete terms, is quite an organic process. And this is very interesting that we're here, the ACT and A, right? Like, and many more letters that could be added to the mix. Because the way we work is also a bit like that. We were confronted with this problem of salmon farms. Almost like the second day we were in Sky, the first people we met, it was like, pfft. And there is, yeah, how do you start? And they've been fighting for decades, all these farms. But yes, you can do campaigns, you can do social awareness, all kinds of activities. But at the end of the day, also, there needs to be more shifts. And then is when we started, okay, what if we build this kind of table to bring politicians to the tidal zone to discuss with residents, which they are not talking to each other. But you create this kind of forum that destabilizes. It's a space that is unstable and like not very comfortable. It rains, you get wet, you need to go barefoot or with like rubber boots. You can only be there for 2 hours because the tide is coming in. And it was kind of this kind of friction, or by creating that space of friction, that perhaps that's allowed certain conversations to happen. And then is when you require also fabrication to make that. Then also, actually, if you want to spread the message in different parts of the island, you also want to work with restaurants. So then we started also a cooking apprenticeship program. But then also we worked with a school that is teaching construction skills that could reuse the waste from the restaurants. And slowly, it was kind of a series of methodologies that have been accumulating as we were encountering, I don't know, challenges or opportunities to think of that. Overall, the goal is this transition from salmon farming into something else. And that will take maybe 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But yeah, what baby steps you take to shake things a bit?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's become quite incredible how expansive the interventions have been on the island of Skye. Because I think when I first met you, both in 2020, you only had the oyster table set up. And now it's become an entire program of not only educational initiatives, but now beginning to work with the architecture of the island itself. Maybe to close off the conversation, I would be really curious to hear you guys expand a bit about the recent collaborations with Nidam and Sakyam. I would be curious to hear how you got connected and what. Maybe if you could expand a bit on the most recent exhibition in Edinburgh, I believe.
Yeah. It's a
Yeah,
very long
so I
story.
No, it's first of all, it's very, very sad that Nida cannot be here because of like ongoing bureaucratic nightmares. And I think this is a lot kind of our whole collaboration that we kind of started with Sakya was exactly kind of based on a series of conversations that were happening kind of internally around the Turner Prize, around kind of the silencing of Palestinian voices and how we could use the platform that we had like around the Turner Prize. And when kind of we kind of got, I mean, we met Sahar and Nida like back in 2017 and kind of followed their work since, but then kind of the communication kind of became quite regular kind of through this process, and we were invited to do a project at the Royal Botanic Garden, and basically there was an opportunity, I think, for us again to kind of how to connect certain kind of struggles that are happening that are very, very kind of different, but also share kind of similar questions around land dispossession and commoning. And I think this is kind of a project that Sakya is like heavily invested in those questions. So they're basically our kind of exhibition that was called In the Eddy of the Stream, kind of basically traced kind of the history of land dispossession in Scotland and kind of very much connecting it kind of to the industrialization of species, kind of through sheep and salmon in Scotland. And in their case, basically, they brought kind of all of the work about kind of commoning the land on which they sit on, and basically the kind of multiple dispossessions that are happening from like Israeli kind of government, Israeli settlers, and also kind of from rapid urbanization projects. So basically through a series of works that actually, like some we kind of showed here that kind of dealing kind of with how would you see this kind of material development of the new tiles and the use of kind of waste and the setting up of all of these initiatives that we're doing in Skye can enable kind of an act of commoning kind of land in the intertidal zone, and in Saki's case, how kind of similar processes could be traced both from the land themselves, and also they did an incredible project basically where they identified all of these species that were classed as invasive species that were basically during the British Mandate, they were kind of classed as kind of non-commercial, kind of disruptive weeds. And then basically all of them were, they found them in the collection, the botany collection, the Royal Botanic Garden, but they were all classed as plants from Israel, right? Even though they were collected like in the early 1910s, 20s, where like the state of Israel was very far from being formed. So, and through kind of process of like burying all of these histories and kind of incorporating the histories into the collection at the Royal Botanic Garden, that kind of opened another layer of these questions around commoning.
Fantastic. Well, it's really wonderful to have had you here at MIT. We all want to thank you very much for joining us. I think we're right on time for the closing
well on
remarks.
time. I just want to give some closing remarks. Well, thank you everyone for coming, joining us tonight. Special thanks to all the faculty, students, staff members who made this event possible, especially all these staff members with small children and future children. Amanda Moore, Marisa Friedman, Kazi Shiraki, thank you so much. You made this really successful evening. Before we leave, I also would like to invite you to join us on October 20th, Thursday at 6 p.m. for a lecture, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine